Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is David Pivtorak, who is an independent rights lawyer who was born in Soviet Ukraine and came of age in the free United States of America and has watched the encroachment of illiberalism across the United States of America and is taking a stand for that via lawfare. In this conversation, we talk a lot about the Civil Rights Amendment, anti-discrimination laws, and how the United States government is using them to enforce its will on the citizens of the United States and the trade-offs between anti-discrimination law and civil rights law and individual rights and freedoms. If you are interested in more David, do check the links down in the description. I find him a really great guy to talk to, and he's a part of this series that I've been doing on the right wing or the dissident right. And so this fleshes out a little bit more of those who are fighting for liberties and for tradition in the face of a increasingly illiberal system of control. Without further ado, here is David Pivtorak. How'd you get into this saving the Constitution thing? Was it always like a passion of yours, or were you a late bloomer into liberal defense?
Professionally.
Yeah.
I would say professionally, I was kind of a late bloomer. My instinct for justice, I think, was always there in terms of my professional life, but in terms of the political aspect of it, I would say that is definitely a more recent thing. But personally, I've been reading this stuff. I've been interested in it since probably high school.
Yeah.
Although, my background is I'm from Soviet Ukraine. I was born there. So I grew up with it. Pretty much my entire existence has been political in some sense.
Oh, wow.
Meaning the education was from a very early age.
So you were born in Ukraine. In terms of my
personal interest.
Soviet Ukraine. So to what degree did you witness the change from Soviet to post-Soviet life?
I didn't. We left about 2 years before perestroika, before the fall of the regime. So we didn't really see any of that. I was young. I can't even remember whether this actually even started, sort of the initial phase of communism falling apart. I don't remember if that was even on the radar. Maybe it was. My parents, grandparents probably be able to speak about it better, but in terms of what I witnessed, it was just the same old, same old. I think the difference was that there was that program that Reagan initiated that essentially traded us for wheat, that allowed a lot of us Soviet Jews to come over.
Really?
Yeah, it was this great refugee program that Reagan negotiated with the Soviets, where essentially the U.S. would get Jews and the Soviet Union would get wheat.
Oh, wow. Okay. What was that program called? I have never heard of this.
No, I don't remember the exact name of it, but
okay.
I'm sure you could find it pretty easily.
Interesting. What does it feel like to be traded for wheat? That's such a weird...
Well, listen, man, given that I could be in a ditch somewhere, outside Kiev right now, pretty fucking good.
Wow. Do you have, are you conscious or cognizant of any, of like the influence of that lifestyle and your parents coming from that life to America and the translation for them and you growing up during that? Has that had an influence on your family that you're aware of? Like their
what do you mean in terms of how we frame what we see is happening here politically? Is that what you mean?
The changes in America now is one tact to take, but I'm just wondering, going from a state of like being a Jew in Soviet Ukraine to being, becoming an American, and the way that life happens here versus there. And I don't know, I would assume there's quite a difference in that and in the culture and like watching your parents adapt to that might have influenced your childhood, or I wonder if that, what they instilled in you as values of appreciation in this way of life, as opposed to Soviet Ukraine and the stories that they told you, and maybe some of the trauma, or just the like maybe they had to be bottled up over there and were able to be open over here, and how that influenced you.
That's a lot. There's a lot to unpack, right?
Yeah.
I don't even know where to begin with that. It's almost living in a different universe. I only experienced it as a kid, but I was there for the bread lines. I was there for the destitute conditions, the poverty, just the want, I guess you could call it. And when people complain about poverty in this country, it almost seems silly in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are obviously areas here where you do see it, where there is just people are deprived of everything and just don't have anything. And you have very serious poverty in certain pockets of the country, but the shelves are always full anywhere you go in this country.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Everything is available. I think that's the key difference.
Hmm.
In this country, really everything is available. It's just about having the resources or the capacity to acquire it.
Hmm.
There, it was a completely different story. Doesn't matter what your aptitude was, how capable you are. No matter how much money you have, there's nothing on the shelf.
Mm-hmm.
You're standing in that bread line. And unless you had a special in with the corrupt supermarket owner that had their own in with the Politburo, you weren't getting stuff. I tell the story all the time. It was wild when we came over here. Bananas were widely available. I could get a banana anytime I wanted. And to me, that it's just the one thing I remember as a kid. It blew my freaking mind because my grandpa, because he was a World War II vet and he was wounded and was decorated, they had a program for disabled vets where he had these coupons that you can redeem for bananas, like a bushel of bananas. I don't know, once a month or a few times a year. I don't remember exactly what it was, but that was the lap of luxury for us. And because he had that specific in, that gave us access to this thing that nobody else had access to. And then coming over here and just being able to go to the store, get a bushel of bananas anytime you want, just seeing them rot, mind blowing.
Yeah.
Orange juice, pizza. I mean, it's, steak, any of that stuff. So you go from that environment to something here. You really learn appreciation. I think that's why you see Cuban Americans in Miami and everywhere else. Why are they so rabidly patriotic? Because they've seen what the other thing leads to.
Mm-hmm.
And same thing, the most conservative, patriotic people who love America more than anyone else are usually people who come from communist countries.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a reason for that, because they've lived through the alternative.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And they see that for all its flaws and things that can be corrected, the alternative is just way worse. And so that was from a very young age. That was basically drilled into my head.
Yeah. This is a completely other topic. It's a really big topic, but this number keeps on popping up in my newsfeed on Twitter. Like there's 70,000 homeless in LA right now. Like there's this massive amount of homelessness and encampments and stuff like that.
Yeah.
In America, I'm wondering if you have a perspective on that. I know, and this can go in all these different directions about policy or,
Yeah.
But if you're talking about like Soviet Union and the inability to get resources no matter what, and then we see rising homelessness in these very liberal states in America, what we call liberal states in America. Is that like, what's the perspective on that? Is that a failure of the elite? Is that a failure of the American system? Is that like a voluntary thing on behalf of the homelessness or the homeless or the houseless or whatever they're supposed to be called now, or whatever I'm supposed to call them now? I know there's a lot of different factors there, but if you're just thinking about Soviet Union and the paucity that you guys were experiencing, and then what's happening in America now, it's got to be kind of mixed emotions going on what that problem is manifesting or what that's showing us about how we're living now.
I don't think so. I don't think there's sort of too much to be made about that connection. My personal perspective, and this is just from looking into it, reading about it, and living through it, is the fact of the matter is, if we didn't have to live through those ACLU inspired Supreme Court decisions back in the 60s and 70s, in those Berger and Warren courts, and the ending of involuntary putting people in the institutions, right?
Okay.
If we didn't
mental
have any
institutions,
of that,
the disbanding of those, which is also another Reagan policy, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, fairly, yes. That was one of his, I think, when he was in charge. So he's definitely not guilt-free in all this. But you can't have involuntary confinement, legally speaking. Right. So even if there's this person right outside my window, which you probably will hear at some point, screaming his head off and threatening people, you can't confine them. Your hands are tied, and that's there's a lot going on here, right? The money that's being pumped in by the NGOs for the homeless industrial complex that is raking in billions of dollars. I mean, California just put in $50 billion for God knows what. Apparently it was to house these people, but I don't know how many units have actually been built. It costs about $1 million to build one housing unit for these people, right? So there's an entire industry built on keeping these people on the street. Why is it that LA has more homeless people than anywhere else in the entire country? Why are so many people here? Because there's an entire industry set up for them that A, legally allows them to be on the street, but also B, allows them limitless access to drugs without any repercussions. Right? So if we change two things, if we have involuntary confinement, if we bring that back, and two, if we start arresting these people, prosecuting them, and making them personally responsible, right? Like if you want to do drugs, get a job, get a house, right? That should be a requirement. You should be allowed to, or you should be required to show a certain amount of self-sufficiency, then do all the drugs in the world. Like, I'm super libertarian about that. If you can act like an adult, do all the drugs in the world. But if you remove that, right? If you remove the people who are just straight up junkies and the people who should be confined in a mental institution, 90 to 95% of the homeless in the city disappear. Because almost none of those people are actually from this area.
They'll come there because they can do whatever they want.
Because it's Mecca.
Yeah.
If you're homeless and you want to live on a tent on a public street and just shoot fentanyl all day, this is where you go. Or San Francisco. Or Seattle, right?
Yeah.
Not too familiar with it, but yeah, from what I hear.
Very much so. Yeah, it's interesting. I was just at a party, and some witty guy was talking about how you'd get arrested or harassed by the police for setting off fireworks. But if you said, well, I stole the fireworks and I'm doing fentanyl, the police would leave you alone, right? You can do whatever you want. But if you're an upstanding citizen, then you're the one who is cracked down on for celebrating your country, or, for being a dick with a bunch of M80s or whatever, There's a sliding scale. But
Narco Tyranny, right?
Yeah, it is anarcho-tyranny. And that's a cool concept. Could you explain that? Because I think that my audience would, like a refresher on that. But it's a really interesting concept, and we can tie it back to our
I can,
conversation.
yeah, yeah. Shoot, I can. Let me try because
Put you on the spot. Yeah.
it's been a while. Yeah, yeah, it's been a while since I really dug into it. But essentially, the concept is that the powers that be in a jurisdiction or in the country in general, basically what they do is they allow criminals to run rampant, and they have a hands-off policy with criminals. But as soon as law-abiding citizens step out of line or try to defend themselves or protect their property, they're the ones that get punished. And there's actually, I hate to bring it back to this again, but Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Gulag Archipelago, yeah.
Yeah.
So he had a great quote in that book about the Soviet cops. If they catch a criminal with a knife, they let him go because for a criminal, he doesn't know any better. That's his tradition. But if you, as a citizen, get caught with a knife, you
should know better.
You're an insurrectionist.
Yeah.
You're a criminal.
Yeah.
And that's basically where the concept of narco tyranny comes from. Yeah. It's putting the law-abiding citizen in this sort of chaotic, fearful mental state, creating a dependence on the state itself, because you can't protect yourself, like we saw with Daniel Penny in the news, the guy in the subway who tried to protect himself and other people.
Yeah,
bunch of stories like that where they let criminals and homeless run rampant, attack and steal from people, and as soon as they defend themselves, the state comes down because the state reserves for itself the power to police everyone. Yeah. But at the same time, they're hands off on policing.
Yeah,
because they want you scared. They want you dependent on them.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Demoralization of the citizenry is one of the main elements of mind control.
Yeah. There's so many
I don't
different...
know. Does that match your? I hope that was.
Yeah, that it's just a good thing to think about, because
narco tyranny.
If we're seeing something happen to our country, there's this growing destabilization, especially in the cities, and depolicing and very selective policing in the way that you describe, where the middle class and the upstanding citizen and the productive citizen is being squeezed out and demoralized. And that's the bedrock of our country. That's the bedrock of our success and our wealth and our fortune, is the middle class, is the moral individual citizen. And then the government is playing these tricks on us and squeezing us out and doing terrible things to our children. The public schools are now public indoctrination centers, and you see this ruling elite that are acting more and more like these corrupt. I don't want to say exactly like the Soviets, but it raises a question, like, what's going on in their minds? What is going on in the mind of the state that it's reproducing the conditions of Soviet Russia, and then also whinging about freedom whenever, the Republicans or the conservatives or, even the liberals stand up against it. Like, whinging about democracy. If you vote for this other guy, you're voting against democracy, right?
Yes.
Like wrapped in, when communism comes to the United States, it's wrapped in the flag and screaming at a podium with red lights behind them. Biden's infamous, and they're kind of proud of being hypocrites and stuff like that. I'm just wondering from your perspective, and especially as we broach or move the conversation into what you're doing, which I want to call AntiWoke Lawfare, or using the legal system to enforce civil rights, to bring our American values back online and defend them against the NGO process, or industrial complex, against all these things. I'm throwing a lot of things out there, but I'm seeing a lot of similarities between the deep state, or what is basically the deep state, like this big bureaucratic marriage between NGOs, hyper wealthy elites, and the government, and Gavin Newsom and the mayor of LA. Like, they're all on board of kind of ruining our country in a way, and what was going on in the Soviet era.
So I have a working theory. For the longest time, I've been meaning to post like a whole Twitter thread about it.
Mm-hmm.
I just never got around to it. But you know what? I'll work it out with you here right now.
Let's do it live.
Let's we'll do it live, as Bill
Off the
O'Reilly
cuff.
used to say. Yeah. Just talk it out with me. See if it makes any sense.
Yeah.
Uh, I think a lot of the playbook and the tactics are maybe quasi-Soviet. I would say it's got those leanings in terms of authoritarianism and the general mind fuckery and the dissolution of truth. So I think there's an
Mm.
element of that to it, but I don't think it's entirely that. Uh, so there's this German documentary called The Net. It's 20 years old. Have you ever heard of it?
No.
So it's a documentary that ostensibly is about Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. It's supposed to be about him on the surface, and that's the running theme essentially in it. But there's a fascinating kind of background story on trying to explain what happened to him and how he got to be the way he is. And it goes back to him at Harvard back in post World War II, going on into the 60s, in that era where psychology and the deep state or government involvement, let's say, in these psychological programs was going on. And it sounds like what happened was there was this combined effort after World War II to try to prevent the horrors of the Holocaust from happening again. And the concerted effort was a private public marriage to study authoritarianism, to do a psychological study of authoritarianism. And at the time, the leading psychologists of the day apparently tried to use the most advanced computer technology at the time to pinpoint exactly what personality traits are subject or lead to authoritarianism. And what they concluded, freakishly enough, perversely enough, was it was a belief in traditional values, family, God, nation, things like that. And their solution to all that was to create this sort of global citizen,
Mm.
a rootless global citizen that had no connection to their family, to their country, to anything like that, and someone who could be easily manipulated, someone who did not have a firm grasp of objective reality. So
Interesting.
we're talking in a sense, postmodernism, right? All that kind of stuff,
Yeah.
New World Order, all those things that have been making their way into the narrative, I would say, over the last couple of years. So that was their goal. What they were going to do is they were going to create this citizen who was, as we talked about, sort of dependent on the state, who could be manipulated, who had a very subjective view of reality, something firm. And here we go: critical race theory, queer theory, these no sense of boundaries.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You can be whatever you
And
identify
no,
as.
no sense of judging other people's
Yes.
boundaries or behavior. Like this hands off. Like you do whatever you do. I'm not to judge you, right? Which is good to a point, but once it allows like shooting up on the street, then you're like, there's something poisonous about total tolerance, the totalitarian of tolerance kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. And so their goal was to create this completely malleable person, individual who would not as easily be swayed uh, by populism or really these sort of magnetic, charming individuals who tend to be authoritarian.
Yeah, the strong men,
And,
the Caesars.
and one of the
Or
ways
Hitlers.
that they were going to do that was with hallucinogens, acid, right? MK Ultra.
Huh.
So there was this. It's widely believed that the CIA experimented on Kaczynski with you probably heard that with LSD. Whitey Bulger too, apparently. A lot of Manson, he was an MK Ultra, so a lot of these psychos, yeah,
And then they
that
just
are
let
in
them
popular
loose.
culture.
Go forth and prosper.
They were MK Ultra guys, and one of the ways, and kind of here's the payoff. One of the ways that they were going to do this was hallucinogens, but a big factor was technology. They were using the most advanced computers of the day to diagnose these certain personality traits and then mold them into what they thought they were going to be. But at the time, back in the day, they thought the mind control drug was going to be LSD or hallucinogens. What they didn't realize was it was fucking technology the whole time, right? Why do you think woke exploded really like after 2015? Because social media technology, that's really when it all took off. That's really the mind control drug. What is creating these horrible instincts and these desires in like kids to change their sex or to kill themselves all of a sudden? Why are teenage girls feeling more suicidal now, since 2015 than at any time before? You can point to technology, you can point to really social media directly. And so I think what these powers that be that are influencing this change in our society, that are implementing a narco tyranny and all these things, they took that ball, that playbook, and they just ran with it. And they harness technology because who works with the tech companies more than anyone else? The deep state, right?
Well, they would be fools not to.
Federal government.
The power can't just like watch this weapon or this technology come to be and not have a hand in it. I mean, they were there at the founding at DARPA and stuff like that. And
yeah.
Right. So, I mean, it shouldn't come as any surprise that the Twitter files revealed a deep, compact between the ruling elite all the way up to, the person who's in office now, the resident of the United States, as he's called, and, the Twitter and being anti-free speech. Well, this could be a good entry. I just saw, and I didn't get to read much into it, but Biden is trying to sue, or the Biden administration is trying to sue, for the right to censor social media. And they were a judge said, no, you can't do that. And they're going back at it again. So it seems more and more baldly evident that the government wants to restrain our freedom of speech online, and just openly. Like, we had the Patriot Act, and then we had Edward Snowden, and that was a big revelation. It shouldn't have been. It's obvious that that's what they're going to do. But now they're just openly like, no, we need to control speech. We cannot allow people freedom of thought because that will ruin democracy. I guess that's their thinking. I'm wondering to what extent you're involved in that, or like how can we use the law, which is kind of an extension of government that was created to restrain government against the government, in order to preserve justice, to preserve freedom. And how have you like come upon or gotten into that work, and what's the landscape there, and what's the hope or the dangers that are existing on that level?
Yeah, well, the Constitution basically provides, or theoretically is supposed to provide that protection.
Yeah.
But I think, as we've seen, it's crucial that we get the right Supreme Court justices on board, because, like in that Harvard, North Carolina decision with the affirmative action in college admissions, you saw there were 3 justices who were completely willing to disregard all the numbers, all the evidence, and who essentially openly said, yeah, it's okay for the government or for entities to pick beneficiary races, and then
in order to fix past discrimination, we need to implement present discrimination. And in order to prevent future discrimination, we need to, or present discrimination, we need future discrimination, which is a line from Kendi's book, Abraham Kendi's book.
Yeah. Essentially, the opinion was candy yes, because the reasoning was essentially racism exists in society, so we're allowed to discriminate
Hmm.
with no end in sight, with no parameters, no guardrails, nothing like that.
Just on faith that it exists and we're going to do the right thing. And what we're doing is the right thing. Discrimination is the answer to discrimination. Fight fire with fire.
Leave it to the experts.
Yes. Okay.
That was defer to the experts on that. That was the main
Really?
gist of Jackson's. Yes.
Okay. Well, and what does that mean?
Yeah.
Who are these experts? Who chooses the experts? Who experts the experts?
Yeah. That's
Who legitimizes the experts? Well, the experts legitimize the experts, right?
that was Thomas's critique,
Yeah.
where he just went after her for it, because he said that's, it's endless. There's at that point there is zero control.
Hmm.
So the Constitution really is the one document, right? It's that unique single thing that prevents our government from doing all the things that governments around the world have done and are doing.
Yeah.
Like our neighbors to the north. Canada doesn't have free speech.
According to the dissident right, or elite theorists, the Machiavellian Riot, right now, they're really honest. They say, yes, this Constitution thing's a wonderful thing, but it's just a document. It doesn't actually, in effect, it doesn't exist. It doesn't have any power. We are not living under the rule of that because it's not being implemented. And then when you see the Supreme Court implement it, then they are immediately delegitimized by that huge complex, by all the NGOs, all the Democrats, all the entire state just says, well, we just need to disregard you. AOC, for whatever she's worth, came out and said, well, we just need to ignore them. If they don't do what we want, then we just ignore them, right? If they try to implement this Constitution, what we do is ignore it. So without enforcement, there's no legitimacy. Like, in effect, there's no legitimacy. So how do we preserve the legitimacy of the court that's acting in alignment with the Constitution?
That's the scary question, because like I just said, if Trump didn't get into office when he did,
mm-hmm.
if it was Hillary, not Trump, if Mitch McConnell didn't hold up, what's his name, the AG, why am I blanking on his name now? Anyway, if he didn't hold up his nomination, we'd have a much
Bill
different
Barr?
court right now. No. It was Merrick Garland. That's
okay. Garland. Okay.
Merrick Garland. Yeah. The AG right now. So before Trump got into office, Mitch McConnell held up the Garland nomination.
Okay.
Saying, Why don't we we're about to have an election. The people should pick who the next nominee is. If RBG didn't die when she died, if all these things didn't happen, the makeup of the court would be much different now. And that thing that you said that the dissident right talks about, that it's just a piece of paper. In some ways, they're 100% right. Because if the state being able to discriminate, if the state being able to suppress speech really depends on the makeup of the people who are on this court, then it's not great. But at the same time, what's the alternative? To have a strong man in power? Because that's, as I understand it, that's the counter argument. And I'm
a Caesar.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
like
Garvin,
what Trump promised to be, but actually didn't have the capacity to be. Somebody could come in there, disband all the 3-letter agencies and restart the government. Kind of like what Elon did with Twitter. Just cut out all the graft and the grift.
Yeah.
And just like, what is the government essentially? What is it supposed to be? And we're going to recreate the government in the modern world according to the Constitution principles.
Yeah. That's a great idea. And in some ways, it is doable if there's a strong enough executive in power. But at the end of the day, it doesn't strip down the NGOs. They're private entities. They don't disappear.
Hmm.
It doesn't strip down
Okay.
the
These shadow
the Democrats
governments.
in Congress and in the Senate. It doesn't. Yeah, maybe some of the federal agencies don't exist, but they're not essentially the ones doing all the heavy lifting.
Yeah, they're not the ones writing the policy that are then signed off on by the Congress, right? Like all these
Yeah,
lobbyists are the ones who actually
or the
implement.
corporations,
Yeah, and the corpse. Yeah.
because they're complicit in it too. So what are you going to do? You can't, right? You can have a strong executive, but he's not in charge of private corporations.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree. I agree with the philosophy that the Constitution, yeah, it's just a piece of paper, but literally anything is just a piece of paper if you don't have the guns or the wherewithal or the power to enforce it. So in a way, yes, it does come down to power, but of course that also has its limits because the corporations and the NGOs and these federal agencies and the deep state, right? I don't, yeah, I maybe the executive can come in and sort of dissolve or weaken the deep state, but Kennedy tried to do that, and we saw what happened there.
Okay, well, you're presenting a very
a lot of guys did, but yeah, I'm just
cynical
saying
picture. I mean, well, you're not cynical, but like this is
yeah,
like the deck is stacked.
it certainly is, and I'm not sure that Caesarism or as much as I respect Yarvin and love a lot of his insights, I don't think I've heard an adequate explanation for what happens when it's not your Caesar who's in charge,
Yeah,
but their Caesar.
yeah, yeah. Well, they don't need a
What
Caesar
what
because
happens then?
they're all in lockstep. And like you're saying, you're pointing out that power is beyond government, right? And what we see with the internet and these internet giants, they are much bigger than the government, right? So the government has to be involved and pressure them as much as it can to keep, itself in line with them. So if they aren't ruled, if we are ruled by these unruled, unaccountable entities, like what is even the law? Like, I guess why fight then? Like, where is the foothold? How do we fight? What do we fight for? How do we organize? How do we live within it if it's just going to go on? How do we preserve these values and keep ourselves held together and actually believe in that flag behind you?
I think, for me at least, it does start with the Constitution,
Okay.
and it does start with being faithful to it and doing everything in your power to maintain faithfulness to the reading and to the values and the promises that it dictates.
Mm-hmm.
So, so really, it does require lawfare while we still can, right? While we still have that Supreme Court majority, then it requires doing everything in our power to cut back a lot of the excesses that we're seeing right now. So yeah, it does involve doing what Trump promised to do but couldn't do.
Mm-hmm.
Cut down those agencies, NDEI, cut back a lot of the administrative powers, right? The Chevron doctrine, which I think the Supreme Court is about to take up, which allows the agencies almost unlimited power to essentially legislate.
Could you
Right?
give
These
like
three
the details of that? Is this about the FDA and the power of the FDA to make up its own laws? I know I read something about that.
It's sort of connected, but so Congress gave these three-letter agencies certain powers to create regulations on issues that Congress didn't legislate on directly. So there's yeah. So it gave them
Muddled
it
and
gave them
Paul.
certain Well, yeah, and that's what's been a big fight this entire time. And of course, when you give them an inch, they're going to take that mile.
Yeah.
And the regulations that they've been allowed to promulgate have expanded and expanded and expanded until they're basically taking over the congressional role. So they're some of the more conservative members of the Supreme Court have been trying to pare that down to basically tell Congress, like, hey, you can't just delegate your duty to these unelected, unaccountable agencies. If you want a certain law, if you want a certain policy to go forward, write a law. Make sure everyone agrees, because it's a huge workaround to actually having people vote for policies that they agree with. Why do you think laws don't get? Why do you think there's such gridlock in Congress? Because you really can't get people to agree on these huge sweeping policies, and that's a good thing. So I think creating more gridlock in the federal government, just in government in general, is a good thing. So I think that's one way to slow them down. But
yeah.
Where do we start talking about? So Chevron doctrine.
Yeah.
That's one way to decrease or disempower a lot of these excesses that the government and these other quasi-governmental agencies have been pumping out.
There's this concept, and I don't really know how to describe it, but and it doesn't happen so much on computers anymore, but these programs would, especially Microsoft, Windows, there would be these programs that have these things called a memory leak, where the program somehow just started taking over more and more memory and more and more memory and more and more memory from the computer until the computer would lock up. And it sounds like that's a power leak. Like they kind of designed this policy that just created more and more regulation, more and more regulation, more and more regulation. And it was just like hogging up more and more and more the bandwidth of the entire country. Like the federal government just sprawling and sprawling and sprawling. And it just seems like it's this infinite loop where it's always going to be choosing the thing that increases its function to create more function for itself, which is similar to communism. In effect, once you have this centralized, unaccountable thing that rules over itself, it has no purpose other than to serve itself until there's no food on the shelves, until like the whole works are really gummed up. And you can see a lot, if you're particularly paranoid or insightful, depending on how you want to look at it, you'll see, with how COVID was enacted or COVID was responded to, like government took steps, especially in the West, like the left coast, every government like Oregon, Washington, and California, they all took steps that would increase their power. Jay Inslee up here declared himself he gave himself emergency powers, and he didn't give them up until a couple months ago, like far beyond what he needed. And every step that he took was to increase his administration's ability to control the lives of the citizens, to protect the citizens. But it always favored having more power over itself. The Constitution is there to limit that. And it seems like it's been worked around constantly at every step. So I just don't know if it's human nature or government's nature or power's nature to completely just ignore this concept, and if it's even naive to believe that the Constitution could affect any change other than these small little victories. And I guess to counter that, like, we can do these targeted attacks on power to limit it, to cut off its toes, to try to cut off one of its heads. But the fight will be continual. There will never be an end state. It will always be a constant struggle against. And I think that, conservatives, broadly speaking, are wooed by these small little victories, wooed by these little book bans, wooed by these little transgender laws, or all these different like culture war fronts. Like there's like, oh, we got this victory. Bud Light has now lost a bunch of stock, or Target lost a bunch of valuation. But it's like, it's kind of like the state of nature is that power, like the Leviathan, it's just, to mount an attack on it is such a long process. So I'm just like, it's easy to give up hope, or to set your sights so low that you don't really understand that the fight for justice is a continual thing.
Yeah. Painting a pretty dark portrait here, aren't
Yeah,
we?
yeah, I am. So I'm trying to
And it's
bring that up in order to say, where is the hope? What is the practical path forward from your point of view?
I think it's just what you said. You got to keep fighting. If you look at it historically speaking, has there ever been a nation, a country, anything like that that has been as relatively free and prosperous for as many people as this country has? Right. I think that's the glimmer of hope. We're really working without precedent here historically. There's never been an experiment, a national experiment with our Constitution, with our set of ideals and systems that the founding fathers created in the history of man. There's nothing like this that has ever existed. Humanity's history is essentially what you described. It's the rule of power, not the rule of law, of certain ideals and stuff like that. It's always been power. And even in places that have these inklings of these certain ideas, it's always descended into barbarism or something where they've had to start over. So I think we have to keep an eye on the past, but also think about how we're going to preserve what we have. And that's by looking at what got us here. Look at the values that got us here. Look at the systems that got us here, and try to replicate them. And I think a big part of that is maintaining and outlining the core values of the Constitution, right? So speech. Why is Canada falling apart? Why are parts of Europe falling apart? They don't have a First Amendment. And as they always say, the second protects the first. So I think our broad right to self-defense and a really, really broad First Amendment, not just legally, but culturally, to speak freely and without fear that you'll get shut down either by the government or certain powerful private groups. So as long as that value is maintained, and there's only one way to do that, and that's through lawfare, legislation and through lawfare. And I think, as we've seen, when people have free access to information and ideas, they tend to revert to more freedom rather than less, rather than to oppression, authoritarianism, what have you. Generally speaking, it's not perfect, but it is a fight. That's why people like me do what I do. And that's why there are a ton of legal organizations, a lot of public interest groups whose entire focus is just fighting the government every time it steps out of line, and creating that precedent, and then taking it all the way up to the Supreme Court to vindicate or further bolster whatever the power of that individual right is.
Okay.
Because really, that's essentially what it is. It's individual rights. And FDR kind of started rolling us in a fucked up direction when he threatened to pack the Supreme Court, essentially extorted them into ruling in his favor. And a lot of this stuff started during his time.
Could you expound on that?
Of course, yeah. Yeah. So in order to implement a lot of his policies, he had to violate private property rights of individuals. Put forth all these public programs. He had to basically take away the rights and property of a lot of citizens. And I'm not even getting to the Japanese internment. It really started. One of the worst things to ever happen at the Supreme Court's early 20th century decision, Wickard v. Filburn, the wheat, going back to wheat, nice callback. So essentially ruled that a farmer growing wheat on his own land for his own private use was interstate commerce.
Okay. And therefore under the auspices of the federal government.
Precisely.
What's the reasoning behind that? Okay.
What was the court's reasoning, or why did they try to push through this decision?
Both. How did they justify that? Why did they want this, and how did they justify it?
Yeah. So the reason they said it was interstate commerce was through a great leap of logic that essentially said, well, if since you're growing wheat on your own property, that means you're not buying bread or wheat from another farmer or from the supermarket or from the other dealer. And this means that the wheat that could have been brought across state lines or would have otherwise been interstate commerce, you're clogging up the system.
Okay. By not participating in the market, we're going to punish you, basically.
You're affecting the market. You're substantially affecting the market.
Huh.
So through that great leap of logic, that's how you have essentially anything being falling under the auspices of the control of the federal government. Because almost literally anything would fall under interstate commerce under this definition. And this is how we got to one of the biggest expansions of the federal government, because now they can control what you grow on your land, what you do on your property. This is how they were able to pass the Civil Rights Act, right, which controlled who private businesses associate with and do business with. Mm-hmm. Because again, you're a tiny diner in somewhere in Texas, right? In a small town in Texas, well, you're affecting interstate commerce. Hmm. Because the stuff that you get shipped, the eggs, the meat, whatever, flour, that touches on some part of interstate commerce. Mm-hmm. And that gave the legal justification for passing a lot of this. And so after that, essentially,
and that was a huge, just a footnote, that is a huge bane for this. The civil rights movement is a huge bane for this entire process of the state, because it gives it a almost like you can't argue against it because it's so morally sound.
Yes.
It's so morally sound that people should be treated as people. And what they sneak in there is that the government should enforce treating people in a certain way. That the government power hides behind this virtue, this really great American, or just a great humanitarian virtue. And then so the government's going to come in here and make sure that the populace is acting morally. And then it's hidden behind that, so it can do whatever it wants. It can go infinitely. Into forcing people to bake cakes, there was another one. This is kind of like a little seedy, but like there's this nude gay resort that now has to let in women. Like they can't have a private association for them to do their cockamamie fun times without women present. I don't know why a woman would want to be there, but some women want to be there, and so now they have to have women there. But that's it doesn't stop the government telling the citizen what to do. And that's really interesting. That goes from like the farmer growing his own wheat to the Civil Rights Act, which is disbanding segregation. And then where does it end?
Yeah. The road to hell is paved with great intentions. And that's the problem. And that's the thing that Goldwater was warning about during his campaign when he lost to LBJ. That was one of his great oppositions to the passing of the Civil Rights Act, which ostensibly was this amazing moral victory. Mm-hmm. Like you said, how can you root against that? How can you root against people treating others as equals human beings.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in that Trojan horse was that element of government inserting itself into private life.
Yeah.
And that's how it starts. And if you want to talk about sort of unwinding this process of government inserting itself into speech and just in everyday
Into
activities,
association. Yeah.
that's where it begins.
Mm-hmm.
Is you have to free people up to associate and kind of do as they please,
Yeah. And which
even if
includes
it has some
discrimination.
shitty consequences.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And
yeah,
I mean,
which is unfortunate, but
yeah.
you
Well,
know, the right to be free means
I
the
know.
right to be a piece of shit.
Yeah, exactly. And I know black intellectuals, black speakers who, if you look at like the consequences of the Civil Rights Act on the black community on a material level, if you go back in time and just flew a drone over the black parts of the country before what are those called, those free tenements that were put up, the projects were put up, they were relatively successful, independent, like they were not as rich, but they were still self-sufficient, and they were doing a lot better before the government came in with these programs. So the white people were shamed into, like not segregating, whatever that means. But the black people there was a psyop on that community. And like materially, they've not benefited from the government insertion. And that's really uncomfortable to say because it's such a moral thing that the Civil Rights Act was intending to do.
Yeah, and obviously the flip side of that is, easy for us to say. Right? It's easy for us to say when you're not walking into Walmart or wherever in San Isidro, and they're like, "Oh no, not you! Get out!
Exactly.
You can't sit." Right?
Yeah.
So it's like,
Okay.
yeah, it's easy
Yes.
to say, but as Thomas Sowell says, all of life, it's just trade-offs.
Yeah.
So what
No
did
solutions.
this trade-off get us?
Yeah. Yeah.
Did it end in, and like you pointed out, did it end in materially better conditions for Black people? Doesn't look like it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I just I go back and I can't rewrite history. Maybe that was a necessary step for authority to come in and enforce that attitude. But I just wish it would have been softer. I wish it would have been kind of, I guess it's manipulation on some point, just people kind of gradually lessening up, focusing on race, just kind of. It seems like it could have been a natural process, but maybe it had to be enforced. This color blindness or this, this human universalism. I don't know. So good counterpoint.
Yeah, that's the problem is we don't know.
Yeah.
Seems like it didn't end up in where it was intended, or didn't put us in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it almost put us in a worse place where now you have an infinite, endless justification for these giant institutions to keep discriminating, but now in reverse.
Yeah. Yeah. What is some of the work that you've done on that front, or the landscape on kind of rolling back DEI, CRT? Where are some of the weak points in this, and some of the advances that the freedom of association, or the opposite of DEI, the anti-discrimination, the actual anti-discrimination contingent is advancing on?
So that recent case that we just talked about, the SFFA case against Harvard, that was pretty huge.
Really?
In terms of it was a narrow ruling, and I've seen a lot of people kind of get over their skis about its impact. Mm-hmm. But I think it was huge in terms of the court laying out where the limits are and what we're not going to tolerate anymore. And the reason I said people got out over their skis was because the decision was really just limited to college admissions. Mm-hmm. And what the equal protection clause means. And and where the government is allowed to use racial classification.
Hmm.
But a lot of people, just even recently on Twitter, I've seen people talk about how it's going to impact the DEI programs for employers and things like that for corporations. That's not what the ruling was. Most
Yeah.
people don't know this, but there is no legal affirmative action in the private sector in employment law generally. Other than this like very narrow exception in an executive order from LBJ's time
Hmm.
that allows certain affirmative action in federal contracting. Beyond that, affirmative action generally is illegal in the workplace. And I think the reason that people make that mistake and believe that it's actually allowed is because I like to analogize it to driving on the highway. I don't know what your speed limits are over there in Washington, but over here, speed limit is usually 65 on the highway.
Hmm.
But if you keep it under 80, they're CHP, the highway patrol, they're not going to pull you over. So, and I've been told that by countless cops. They're like, just keep it under 80, you're good,
Hmm.
right? And for a very long time, the corporations have been operating under that rubric where they've been clearly driving over the speed limit in terms of affirmative action and DI and taking race into account in terms of hiring promotions, etc. But they've been keeping it under 80.
Hmm.
And what happened after our summer of racial reckoning in 2020
Hmm.
was kind of like what happened on the highway during the pandemic, where you're driving along, right? You're doing your 75 or whatever, and a guy passes you literally twice your speed. You're like, holy shit, like must be going 100 something.
Hmm.
And there were no cops on the road during the lockdown. So they got away with it.
Yeah.
So one guy did it, another guy saw it, and was like, hey, you could do it. Why don't I do it? And then everybody's doing 100 on the highway. And that's what these corporations started doing after 2020. One started doing it, they looked around. Hey, we're going to set some racial quotas. Nobody's enforcing it.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
So that's what happened with the companies is they saw that nobody was enforcing the speed limit, so they just went for it, even though what they were already doing was illegal. But now it's just blatantly illegal. And part of what I'm doing
Hmm.
is enforcing the speed limit.
Okay.
I'm trying to pull all of them over. So a lot of the corporations that I've seen with these policies that are very blatant, we filed cases against them. Like I have a class action right now against Amex that's going forward. I have a case against Smith College
Oh yeah. Okay.
representing Jody Smith.
Yeah.
You probably know
Shaw.
her.
Jody Shaw. Yeah.
Jody Shaw. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did I say Jody?
Well, so
Did I say Jody Smith?
yeah, but it was Smith College, so
Oh, okay.
I just know her. We're
Yeah.
friends.
Brain fart.
So so you're using a version of the Civil Rights Act to fight against the neo civil rights movement, right? So you're using precedent or the laws that dictate from the government that corporations, that private entities cannot discriminate based on race or enforce racial quotas to allay the advancement of racial quotas in the name of equity. Is that the process by which you're advancing this?
Yeah, essentially, it's using because the Civil Rights Act doesn't really specify that it's for the benefit of only one racial category.
Okay.
So the law is that Title VII Civil Rights Act and federal anti-discrimination law applies to all races equally.
Okay.
And so we're using those laws to fight against either the blatant affirmative action programs or the soft quota and soft affirmative action programs that these companies are implementing. Because for a long time, I guess they just thought they could get away with it
Yeah.
because nobody really was paying attention. The EOC doesn't really concern itself too much with discrimination against white employees, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a whole host of case law out there that says you can't treat white employees worse than black employees or Hispanic employees or whoever. And the case law is very specific in terms of when a company can implement any kind of racial classification or racial uh, any racial considerations in employment, and it's very, very limited and pretty much doesn't apply to any modern company.
Okay. Is expanding that a good idea?
Well, yeah, that's the question
Yeah.
is do we do we go for just a complete annihilation of these programs or these laws in general? Do we do just a wholesale dissolution of them, or do we do we use them against the people that are discriminating, but in
Yeah.
reverse?
Yeah.
And I think the simple answer is as long as these laws are on the books and you have corporations and government entities going the other way in employment and actively discriminating, uh, why are you going to fight with one hand tied behind your back?
Okay. Yeah.
How do you undo this stuff while while not taking advantage of everything that's out there?
Okay. Yeah. That's very
Yeah, and
practical. Yeah.
and I wouldn't say we're really like expanding the scope of what these laws say because the laws say what they say. And when we apply it in our cases, it's usually not in the same type of fact pattern or the same type of deliberation that pre-existing case law relies on.
How is it different?
Well, in most of those cases, you're talking about blatant discrimination by a majority white company or something like that against black employees, where it's fairly simple, right? But when the companies do it in reverse, there's a completely not a completely different fact pattern, but sort of a different thought process involved because when you look at it, it's funny. It's not white on black discrimination that the traditional case law has seen, but it's mostly white on white
Yeah.
because the majority of these companies they're mostly white. The executives that are implementing these policies are almost uniformly white.
How does that change the so-called fact pattern? White on white discrimination versus white on black discrimination.
Yeah, well, it's a lot. I mean, obviously, it's a lot easier to point it out when it's
Cross race.
white on
Yeah.
black, or yeah,
Yeah.
when it's cross race. But when it's same race, it doesn't have quite the same. It doesn't quite pass the eye test. Essentially,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
you have to prove a little more. You have you actually have to show that they're implementing these policies because the automatic intuitive visceral reaction is if it's same race, like, well, what's wrong with that? But the case law actually is pretty clear that it doesn't matter who's doing the discriminating. The law says what it says.
Okay. And is that this is a big question? What is the path from the original Constitution and this anti-discrimination law? How did the government give itself the power to enforce discrimination or did they invent something new that's not associated directly to the Constitution? Like, how is this constitutional?
It involves the amendments.
Okay.
So, yeah, the amendments to the Constitution where the original Civil Rights Act was passed in 1866. And that's the federal law, Section 1981, that enforces that allows private entities like regular citizens to sue for discrimination in employment or in private contracts. So that was part of the 13th Amendment.
Okay.
And then after that, yeah, the 14th Amendment, equal protection, but that really applies only when the government discriminates.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then after that, like we talked about, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that implemented Title VII, that prohibited discrimination by any employer, public or private.
Okay. What's the difference between an amendment and a title? And thank you. And sorry that I'm kind of an
Of course. So
idiot here.
The amendments are like our Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
First Amendment, freedom of speech. Second Amendment, that's all in the Bill of Rights. A Title VII was part of the Civil Rights Act, which is something Congress passes as a statute or a law. So it's not part of the Constitution, but it essentially allows you to enforce parts of the Constitution.
So what is it enforcing?
It's like it's an enforcement mechanism.
Okay. Huh.
So yeah, so Section 42 USC 1981 is a code section. So it's a statute, federal law, which allows private individuals to enforce the 13th Amendment, so to speak. It's an enforcement mechanism.
Okay.
Although it doesn't have to be directly tied into the Constitution. So Civil Rights Act of 1964, it's also incorporated into federal law, but you don't need the Constitution to enforce it because it's between private entities. It just says private entities are not allowed to racially discriminate.
Okay. How does that?
So it's not part of the Constitution because it's not prohibiting the government from doing something. It's prohibiting private entities or private citizens from doing something.
But it's using the government to prohibit, or it's enabling the government to prohibit private entities or interact between private entities.
It does, yeah, in terms of dragging people into court.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily the government doing it, although Title VII does have an administrative enforcement arm, which is the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission.
Okay.
And that is the government. That is a federal agency that can individually or separately bring discrimination claims against private companies.
And does it do that? And how does it decide on which ones to do? Like, who controls that? Who uses that lever of power?
Bureaucrats.
Okay.
And yeah, I'm not necessarily saying that pejoratively, but the EEOC usually consists of lifetime government employees or many times long-time government employees who are a lot of them are private lawyers, and they decide which cases they're going to take on, and they don't take on too many of them. Mm-hmm. I think usually it's got to be a big fish, like a big company that is really blatantly discriminating.
Okay.
And the EEOC has the power to come in and enforce the anti-discrimination laws and make them perform certain things or do remedial changes.
Yeah.
And change their policies.
Okay. I'm wondering this again, and I can't get my head around this because I don't really understand the whole mechanism. But how does the Supreme Court regulate, or how does the Constitution regulate the Civil Rights Act? There's a pretty, I don't know to what degree it's accurate or truthful. I haven't read all the critiques of it, but it was a pretty powerful book for me to read. Christopher Caldwell's Age of Entitlement, where he makes an argument that the Civil Rights Act is our Constitution and that the original Constitution isn't our. We're living under two constitutions, and the Civil Rights Act. So I'm wondering, from your point of view, like how does the Civil Rights Act, how does it regulate? It seems like it regulates the country much more than, and it's an extension of the government much more than the Constitution regulates the government. It's the big fish in the room. It's what we're living under, not necessarily the Constitution. So I'm wondering, like, how do we restrain that? It seems like you're using that in order to mitigate or kind of try to even the playing field with regards to discrimination. I'm wondering, is it right or good for the government to be doing this at all, if it should be given the power to, and that brings up, like, why do we have courts? Why do we have civil court? Why do we have the ability for one person to sue for damage against another person? And that seems like a good thing as long as it's adjudicated by rational, reasonable people.
Yeah, I'm still processing Caldwell's theory on all this, but I think he's on the right track, because we do have this overarching federal blob that, like, we talked about before, that it's made its way into every facet of our individual, personal, private existence. And we talked about the Civil Rights Act allowed it to bring its tentacles literally everywhere. And in a certain way, yeah, there is the original Constitution, which was ostensibly about personal freedom, individual rights. And since FDR, since those very broad Supreme Court decisions that Commerce Clause and put the federal government inside your kitchen, in a lot of ways, yeah, there is the inconsistency that, they thought for the public good, right, for the moral good, that we replace these core values of the original Constitution with these new values of equality or equity, if you want to call it that, and being nice, egalitarianism, whatever you want to call it. So there is a conflict there. And I think it is a very important discussion to have, which underscores the importance of not only the legal First Amendment, but the cultural First Amendment, because a lot of these conversations were really not allowed to be had, even though the government didn't do anything to stop them. But culturally, these were not conversations that you could have that allowed you to discuss the trade-offs of what happens when you do have this Civil Rights Act, which requires people to treat each other without regard for their race or anything like that, without calling people racial slurs, dropping N-bombs at the office, which I think everybody can say is a positive. But what is the downside? What have we lost in terms of our own personal freedom with regard to that? And I don't have the answer.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody has the answer, but we do need to start that conversation, because I'm just in the trenches, man. I'm just a dude, like, plugging away with the tools I have.
Yeah.
Like all I have is this anti-discrimination law, so I'm using it to expose and to dismantle what I think is a cancerous outgrowth in our culture. But the greater question is, if I had to lose my livelihood because these laws were no longer in place, is that a public good that would be tolerable for me? And if the answer is that we go back to that original Constitution, a better place of individual freedom and things like that, then fuck yeah. I would much rather live in that place that is not heading towards the quasi-Soviet place that I came from. I can always do something else. Right.
Yeah.
I think the prospect of going in this direction is a lot scarier than me not having this tool.
Well, Yeah, and you're a resourceful guy, so I'm sure you'll figure out another way to involve yourself in the justice
That's
foray.
you're giving me too much credit.
But
Appreciate it.
it's one thing, it's one thing for the government to tell you who you can serve, who you can't serve, and it's one thing for the government to say you can't not allow a black person into your restaurant if your restaurant is connected to the public road. I understand that. Once you kind of start thinking about, like, should the government be doing that, or should people voluntarily do that? Should there be a concerted effort by concerned citizens to change the attitude of other citizens to do that? Should the government be used to do that? And then you have the other case with the gay cake. Like, should Christians be forced, under penalty of losing a bunch of money or whatever, being punished by the government through civil courts, to celebrate or to be involved in producing a cake for something that they just don't agree with? But then kind of like a little bit removed from that is like the freedom of speech argument. If the government can tell me that I have to serve and treat everybody equally in my restaurant, what's to stop the government from telling me to say I have to treat everybody equally on the internet? Like, do I have to, at what point does it restrain the government from controlling my speech? Like, if I want to point out, inconvenient facts about a different race, or like make speculations, or like be kind of racist or sexist, or transphobic or whatever, like, you see the civil rights industry like creating more and more phobias to create more and more things to fight discrimination, because it's, again, people are always going to perpetuate the tools that they have. So is freedom of speech qualitatively different than freedom of association? Is there really any difference between the government telling me who I have to serve and the government telling me what I can and cannot say about people based on their race? Can the government enforce that? And like, where's the line there?
So I think you grasped on something intuitively. That's right now is, I don't know if I call it a gray area, but it's an intersection or overlap in terms of anti-discrimination law and the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. That's what that recent Supreme Court case about the wedding, or the cake, or the wedding photographer, the website lady.
Yeah.
The website lady. That's what that decision from just recently. That's really what that was about. That was about taking back some of the space for freedom of association.
Mm-hmm.
And
you notice that they didn't go after a Muslim photographer. Like, they didn't target a Muslim. They targeted probably a white Christian. They targeted the majority, and they got away with it until it went up to the Supreme Court. Just kind of the pattern of how this stuff works out again.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because in a lot of ways the Supreme Court, ideologically, you can tell they're sort of uncomfortable with how far these laws, or these, quote unquote, rights have expanded into private areas of life. You can tell that, but they're philosophically and they're principally constrained by not only case law, but by the Constitution as well. And so, kind of like me, what I'm doing, they're using the only weapon available, which was these religious freedom laws. Mm-hmm. Or the freedom of association, or religious freedom part of the First Amendment.
Yeah.
Because that's the only tool available to bring back or to constrain some of this expansion of these so-called rights. And one of the problems I saw with that decision is in a lot of ways it discriminates, because you have to have, it only protects religious people. What if you're an atheist that has these same beliefs? Why are you less protected than someone who proclaims to be, Christian or Jew or Muslim or things like that? But again, that's the unfortunate reality. That's the trade-off, because the Supreme Court only has that law that it can rely on to make these claims. But the intersection there, it's tough, because logically speaking, there is a solid disconnect, or there is a logical segregation between the government being able to stop you from, like you said, being racist or sexist, whatever, having bad ideas on the internet, versus who you're required to associate with as a business. Because as a business, you're presumably within that stream of commerce.
Oh, wait, hold on. So if I'm a podcaster, I'm running a business, my business is speech, the government could make a argument that I'm growing wheat that is affecting like I'm doing something that's affecting the market by being discriminatory, if I ever were to be discriminatory, right?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a disconnect there, because commerce really talks about products, material things.
Okay.
And speech is, it really
Entertainment
limits itself to that an actual physical product.
Yeah.
Versus just speech,
is
which
digital
has
photography, like like in the case of this website, that's just digits. It's just flashing lights. It's not a physical product. I guess they have to make a case. I'm just saying, like,
well, I get it. No. Yeah, keep digging, because it's a great point. But there is a much greater base of precedent for speech and what's protected. So I can make the logical distinction. I think the Supreme Court lawyers can make that logical distinction between what you say, what your opinions are, regardless of whether it's on a podcast or on the street, versus selling a physical product or a material product, certain services. But that gray area does exist when we talk about photography or art or anything like that. Or, hey, you're a poet, come, you sell poetry readings, come read at my gay wedding.
Yeah. Or my KKK rally.
Benediction.
Right?
Yeah. Go do a benediction at my alt-right festival. So that's where that line gets a little blurry. But again, there is the distinction where speech is really fundamentally protected by a long line of precedent. Although, like we've seen, logical boundaries are not really what they seem. If you read some of the Harvard affirmative action dissents. And by the way, the craziest thing about that case was the fact that it had to get to the Supreme Court, which pointed out just how obvious the numbers were. So obvious, right? But it got rejected not just by the trial court, but by the appellate court as well.
On what grounds?
So
do they have to say
levels
why?
of review?
Yeah.
They did. But two levels of review looked at those numbers, the ones that the Supreme Court said are just jarring. Right? Anyone with two brain cells to rub together would look at those numbers and go, "You are intentionally engineering the racial makeup of your class."
Yes, and by those numbers, you're talking about like SAT scores, grade average, and then how they are weighted for admission. Like Asians can, they have to be way up here to even get considered, and other races can be down here.
But more so the fact that for a decade, that was definitely a huge part of it, but also the fact that Harvard kept the racial makeup of their classes almost identical for a decade. Like, think about that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Within a couple of percentage points for all the different races.
Mm-hmm.
How is that even feasible without engineering, without intentional engineering?
Mm-hmm.
But two courts looked at that and said, nothing to see here.
Hmm.
So that's a threat is logic, logic and reason, all that stuff is very malleable.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what is a woman? I'm not a
Mm-hmm.
scientist. I'm not a scientist. And that's one of our justices now, is not a
Yeah.
scientist. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's kind of the threat we always have to look out for
Yeah.
is the threat to objective reality. 2 + 2 is 4. Those things. And power does play a role in that.
Hmm.
But I think first you have to rely on ideals and principles,
Okay. Okay. So,
which is the Constitution.
okay. So ideals and principles. So to try to dig into what you were saying about it was unfortunate that the court had a religious beliefs law to protect people from, being sued for discriminating based on their beliefs. And if an atheist has a belief, I know that Maya Forstater in Britain, she took her company to court because she was discriminated for believing that there are two sexes. So the science of biological science of the distinction between male and female is, according to that court, a belief, a protected belief. If you think that that's a problem, how would you, if you have any ideas, like what would be better language to describe or to protect people with regard to their freedom of association, their freedom of belief? If not belief, like, then what? What would be a better term? Like how would we kind of clean up the law a little bit, update the law a little bit?
Yeah, I wouldn't require a religious freedom. I wouldn't require a religious belief or a religious requirement to
Okay,
be
so something has
associated
to
with
be
your.
met, defined as a religious belief in order to meet the requirement of being protected.
Right now, yeah, right now that quasi exception to anti-discrimination laws, that cutout is for religious beliefs, for religious people.
Religious exemptions.
And
Same with vaccine mandates up here in Washington. Like, religious exemptions were allowed, and they tried to strike that down.
yeah, it's very similar. So why can't a person who has firm personal belief or
Yeah.
is one of those
Philosophical.
holistic health,
Yeah.
yeah, philosophical, holistic health, whatever. Why are they not protected? And the weakness of that is the only people that will be protected under these laws are either people with sincere religious beliefs or people with sincere religious belief in the Church of Woke,
Mm-hmm.
because that
Yeah.
because that
Okay.
that's expanded to a quasi religion.
Yeah. Okay. So what? Yeah.
And
What
the
if
people,
Harvard said it's our belief, it's our firm religious belief that equity is important for the outcome of mankind. So therefore, we are protected to discriminate because woke is our belief,
yeah,
right?
there really is no limiting principle here,
Yeah.
and that's the problem. And that's why it goes back to the original conversation. Should people be free to associate without the government's involvement, even if their association is morally distasteful in our eyes?
Yeah. Which covers Harvard discriminating based on race. That would cover that too. It would cover Smith College discriminating against Jody Shaw for violating their religious beliefs and
Yeah,
equity, right?
yeah. So that's our trade-off.
Yeah.
Is are we willing to accept that rollback of those anti-discrimination laws for the prospect of the individual freedom that we think will be a net positive in that direction? And if we do that, where does it all shake out? A lot. Some people philosophize that the reason we have all these woke corporations discriminating against white people is precisely because of these anti-discrimination laws. because they feel they have to follow them, but now they're afraid of getting sued, so
Yeah.
they want to take it to the extreme.
Up the ante, up
I'm
the
not,
ante, yeah.
yeah, I'm not entirely convinced that that's the case for the reasons I talked about before. I don't think the woke takeover of all our institutions really is the result of the civil rights laws and the anti-discrimination laws, and the fact that they're just afraid of getting sued. For me, that doesn't quite connect.
Why not?
But
Because there's a more fervent belief system going on than just fear?
because it's so, these practices and these beliefs are so universal, and they don't really match up with the threat of the lawsuit and the monetary losses. Because if you look at when these companies went woke, the time and how fervently they did it, it just doesn't match up to the threat of the lawsuit. Because it, some time ago, the Supreme Court basically rolled back a lot of the worker protections by enforcing arbitration agreements, which severely limit the monetary recovery for plaintiffs who are suing an employment case. Like, they can't do, basically, they've eliminated class actions and things like that.
Okay. Which favored the big guy in
sense.
aggregate. Yeah, right.
What's that?
That favors the big guy as opposed to the little guy, right? In aggregate. The loss of those protections. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and the arbitration agreements, they favor corporations immensely. Mm-hmm. Just the financial impact of that is huge. So if anything, these corporations really shouldn't even be that concerned about anti-discrimination suits. And the fact that this is happening in Europe too, where they don't have these similar laws, they don't have these similar threats. Mm-hmm. The fact that the woke mindset is taking them over as well doesn't jibe with the idea that they're doing this purely based on fear of litigation.
Okay.
It's something else is going on.
What do you think that is? That's something else.
Well, I think it is the thing that I was trying to work out in the beginning with that Kaczynski documentary. I think it's this idea of the erasure of boundaries and creating a malleable person, because whose favor does that work in? It's these giant conglomerates, and the bigger the corporation gets, if you think about it, it's kind of like a Soviet kolkhoz, the collective farm. These corporations are no longer, they're not capitalist enterprises anymore. Capitalist enterprises where a person owns a business and has a unique stake in the business's success. Now, all the people that run are so far removed, it's owned by, shareholders, or now it's like the stakeholders.
Or even too big to fail holders.
Yeah. And it's just a collective farm where it doesn't matter. They can do whatever they want. And when you have that much power and that many resources, and you're so closely connected to the government, you're basically running a government collective farm. Mm-hmm. And who does that favor? Well, was it Larry Fink, the BlackRock CEO, said that the market wants totalitarianism. The market favors a totalitarian government because why? Because it's predictable, it's stable. Mm-hmm. And when you have a malleable consumer base and malleable employees, you essentially can do whatever you want. There's no threat of competition. There's no threat of anything. You're sitting pretty. And wokeness is directly tied into that. All those things, the erasure of boundaries, it's critical theory, it's New World Order, all those things, all those ideas. Mm-hmm. You'll own nothing and you'll be happy.
Yeah.
It's the person is no longer an individual who has core values. It's just a piece of clay. Mm-hmm. that you sell a can of Pepsi to by showing Kylie Jenner handing one to a cop.
Yeah. Or you sell an education to, or whatever. You're selling whatever to. Yeah. Molding them. Yeah, okay.
So I think that, to me at least,
Hmm.
that's a more solid explanation for why it's going where it's going. And and in a lot of ways, to circle back to the uh, individual rights, the original Constitution, to Caldwell's new Constitution, it seems clear that one of them has a more solid base, a more a more a more solid base that's more faithful to the original founding, to the original Constitution.
Hmm.
And so maybe that is the answer.
Well, yeah, it seems like it's you see a glimmer of it in the dissident right, where when they get done with criticizing the whole power structure, then they're like, well, what now? What do we do? And you see this glimmer in a lot of in the liberals who are done with the critique, the post anti-woke crowd. It's like, okay, this thing is this thing. What do we do? And it does have like this tendency to kind of favor that Tocquevillian smaller communities voluntarily, individual actors voluntarily coming together to do the good for their own place in their own time, and this kind of disconnection from the global mindset into a more particular human-sized livelihood, and then the real diversity of being involved with directly with individuals and that collective culture that then arises, and putting that first, putting those ideals first, and then allowing, kind of not necessarily disconnecting from the system, or stopping critiquing the system, or like kind of just removing yourself from the system, but standing apart from it, living life, or putting your values and your attention into the pocket of real life that exists in this huge network of globalist technocratic capital. I mean, you could go the Kaczynski route, but I think that there is a more moderate like precedent in American life for, kind of carving out, like reinvigorating the American dream, like going for the private property, a good family life, a good community, that character that can't be necessarily controlled, or even quantified by the technocratic system. Something that's almost invisible to that.
There's definitely something to that. It's like my favorite band, Gogol Bordello. Like they say, it's think globally, fuck locally.
Excellent.
And
So, David,
I think that's it. Yeah,
yeah.
that's I think that probably nails it. And maybe we are idealistic and kind of dreamers for believing that's possible in such a technocratic globalist world. Uh, but but it seems like the alternative is much scarier.
Which is like what, like fascistic strongman Caesarism, or just
The sort of
WAFE?
globalist technocratic, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
That thing that you were describing is the counter to localized, individualized interaction and control.
Hmm. Hmm. So how can people, what are some of the projects you're doing this summer, and like cases, if you are allowed to or want to talk about, like particular cases that people can follow and connect with, and learn more from your work and what you're doing on the ground?
Yeah, I think the best way is either follow me on Twitter or Instagram, and I'm both at
Oh,
Piv4Law, PIV the number 4LAW. And I talk about a lot of my cases and just general insights on there. I think that's how we connected.
yeah. Wait, so Instagram, do you do case law, like jury, what like trial law and briefs? Is that what you do? Like you get there with your
I don't.
hot bod, and there's a bunch of pictures of you like arguing a case in front of a very woke jury, or awoken
Yeah,
jury.
yeah. I leave the topless pics for just for stories,
Okay.
the disappearing stories. But you'll see a lot of my cases, where I'm on Tucker. I was talking about my Amex case. I was just on Jesse Waters talking about my First Amendment case, where I'm representing a gay teacher
Hmm.
who was disciplined for talking about transgenderism at a school board meeting.
Oh, at a school board meeting. Interesting.
Yeah,
How was
at a
he
public
disciplined?
meeting.
He said the wrong words, or he disagreed with the prevailing attitude of that culture.
He, yeah, he said basically biology is real. And they took him out of class and suspended him
Yeah.
and didn't let him finish the school year or see his fifth graders graduate.
Yeah, yeah. When we really look hard at that arm of implementing justice, implementing anti-discrimination, implementing values, like, do I really want to let it go? Because you see what's happening in Canada, like the people that are being plucked off and being disbarred or like just kind of thrown under the bus by so-called cancel culture in these professional capacities of nurses and teachers and so on and so forth. They don't have any protection against that. But what we're protecting isn't some neutral ground. We're protecting a value. It's not just anti-discrimination, because anti-discrimination does work in favor of one value, or it works in favor of another value. It can work in favor of equity, and it can work in favor of colorblindness. We're actually have a positive value that we're using the laws to implement, right? The anti-discrimination isn't it's not a neutral value. It goes in a certain direction, or it was intended to go in a certain direction of equality. Yes. And then equity comes along and uses it towards its end. So it's just something that you're making me think about, is that this kind of neutral assumption of rationality, of logic and of the good is not neutral. It is based on a cultural time and a place, and that is what we need to protect and reify when we use these tools. We're using it in that direction.
100%. Yeah. It's trade-offs. It just goes back to trade-offs. And what is the greater evil? Is the greater evil that a person says something that may hurt someone else's feelings? Or is it the complete suppression of ideas and conversation and communications? And as a society, which one are we willing to tolerate? And I guess going back to the Civil Rights Act, at the time, it seemed like the greater evil was not allowing Black people or anyone who wasn't white access to the same facilities and the same benefits in a free society. That's, at the time, that seemed like the greater evil. And in the society and the culture that we're living in now, I think it's worth thinking about and talking about where it's led us, and right now what's causing the greater evil. And that's a hot topic of debate.
Yeah. That's the tension and where the electricity is. So is there like a hero that you have in the legal land, or like somebody you look up to, somebody that you this kind of like your mentor in a way, like intellectually, not necessarily somebody you know, or but somebody that you read, somebody that really inspired you to go for justice in your life and livelihood?
Yeah. I can't point to one particular person or one thinker or individual where I get my personal philosophy from. I take from everyone. I mean, if we're just talking about like a personal hero or someone to aspire to, I think Teddy Roosevelt is probably one of the greatest human beings who's ever lived.
Really?
Even though, yeah, I mean, it's kind of ironic because he was the kind of a great big government guy, sort of the first progressive to push a lot of these things through. But in terms of just a general human being who really just was magnificent in terms of embodying greatness and work ethic and just a moral compass. I think, and just boundless energy. I think he was, probably one of the greatest dudes that's ever lived.
I haven't seen like a modern biopic of him. I wonder why. It seems like he'd be a great study. Maybe Clint
He's
Eastwood
yeah.
will put something together.
They did some. There was an okay one, I think, on PBS.
Oh yeah. Okay.
But you want to read Edmund Morris's three book bio of him.
When did you read that?
Years
Your
back,
formative
like
years. Yeah.
more not that long ago, more than a decade ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, my formative years, I was just reading fiction.
Yeah. Like what? Science fiction or like romance
Not really, no,
novels?
not really sci-fi, just like regular fiction.
Hmm.
I was a literary guy.
Oh really?
So like Barry Hanna, Raymond Carver,
Okay.
uh,
Yeah.
Paul Vonnegut,
Yeah. Okay. And
Stephen
then
King before he lost his mind.
before he went on Twitter. And how did you decide on law then? Was that a practical decision, or was there like kind of a calling kind of thing, like a push, like an internal push?
Yeah, well, I found out my music career wasn't going anywhere, so
Yeah. Are
it
there songs
it
out floating
it
there
gave me
around, like your old
there
band?
there might be, yeah, if
Oh,
you
okay.
if you look around, there's an EP might that may or may not be floating around. I don't know. I haven't checked in a while.
Hmm.
But it allowed me to utilize a lot of the same skill sets,
Hmm.
although it played more to my strengths, which is reasoning, logic, and things like that.
Yeah. 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 Well, cool. Thanks so
Be
much for your
more analytical.
time, David. This has been a great conversation, and it was interesting
Thanks,
to
man.
get
Yeah.
into the weeds with you with regard to law. Again, I'm not like totally on solid ground with that, so I'm always kind of coming at from a completely different, like completely outsider point of view. Like, how does this thing work? What are you talking about? So maybe it's a little interesting for you to kind of explain it to a beginner, and kind of guide me along the way. But it's a really important facet of the whole like cultural milieu and the culture war. Like where it meets the road is through law. And what is that thing called law is something that a lot of us don't know about. We just kind of assume that it's based on something good, but it has to be constantly worked on, and fought over, I guess. It's a field of contest.
Yeah, yeah, and I appreciate it, man, because talking to lay people about it really makes me question my assumptions
Hmm.
and rethink my assumptions about what it is, what does it do, and why is it there? Why do we have it? This was super insightful and helpful for me as well.
Excellent. I'm going to end the recording.